Normally on this channel, we break down the latest policy battles, the market moves, the data points that tell us who's outmaneuvering whom, trade shocks, terrified, sudden pivots that make headlines and shape tomorrow's news cycle. We watch the moves and we try to make sense of what's next. But today I want to step back, not to talk about the winners and losers in a single week, but to look at the fate of entire societies when the game board itself starts to crack. Not the quick victories, but the slow collapse, what it feels like to watch an empire slip away in daily life. If you could watch an empire collapse from the inside, do you think you would notice the end arriving, or would you be the last to know? Today I want to show you what the decline of superpowers really looks like, stripped of drama, stripped of illusions, seen not from the palace balcony, but from the street. We'll look at three vanished giants, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, but mostly we'll ask what happens to the people living through it. What did they see? What did they feel? And what echoes can we hear in America today? If the end of an empire is always sudden in hindsight, why does it feel, while you're living through it, like nothing important is happening at all? Hold on to that. I will return to it before we finish. But before we begin, I want to tell you about something that speaks directly to this theme. I've just released Awake, a book about how to think clearly in an age where collapse doesn't come with sirens. It's not about conspiracy or cynicism, but about clarity. Because when power fades slowly and confusion is the default, the only real defense is a disciplined mind. Awake gives you a practical framework for spotting soft lies, resisting manipulative narratives, and thinking independently, especially when the headlines are screaming for your attention. It's available now with a 10% launch discount this week, and I'll link both the book and the launch video in the description if you want to explore more. Now, let's go back in time and see what collapse really looked like from the street. You know, we usually think of history as a highlight reel, big speeches, dramatic betrayals, fateful decisions made in gilded rooms. But living through it is never that clean. From the inside, collapse is not a headline or a single disaster. It's just life getting a little harder to navigate, a little less certain, until you realize the rules have changed without anyone officially telling you. Nobody in Spain's golden age rolled out of bed one morning and thought, this must be the day we start losing everything. Same with the British, same with the Soviets. The end of a superpower looks less like a spectacular fall and more like a series of ordinary frustrations. Does that remind you of anything? The price of bread creeps up, the taxes get heavier, and the optimism that once held things together starts to sound like background noise. Not one big crash, just a long, quiet adjustment downwind. Imagine Spain in the 1600s if you weren't a king or a general. It's not endless tragedy or cinematic grandeur. It's realizing your coins buy less each month. It's seeing friends move to France or Holland for better chances. It's watching your family's prized silverware become an emergency fund. Nobles who once boasted about building fleets now quietly import ships from abroad at double the price. Day-to-day disappointment just becomes a habit. And closer to our own era, think of the late Soviet Union. The myth was everywhere. Moscow was the city of the future, communism as the winning team. But for regular people, the reality was scarcity, bare shelves, ration lines, wages that felt like a bad joke. People still went to work, still paid taxes, still hoped, still lived. But collapse, when you live through it, is not some grand big event. It's more like a winter that drags on month after month, while everyone pretends spring is just around the corner. Now, there's something almost eerie about how these stories play out, no matter where you look. Madrid, London, New York. The details change, of course, but the rhythm stays weirdly consistent. First, there's a burst of optimism, then a period of overreaching, and finally that slow, grinding sense of exhaustion that creeps into everything. It always starts with this quiet confidence. Call it hubris, call it wishful thinking if you like. There's this underlying belief that what we have now is solid, that prosperity is just how the world works for us. For Spain, it was the endless river of silver from the Americas. For Britain, it was the pound, global, steady, as reliable as the sunrise. And for America, it's been the dollar, the stock market, the aircraft carrier, the feeling that whatever happens, America's going to ride it out because it always has. But if you pay attention, you start to notice a pattern, a kind of choreography that plays out in stages, almost like clockwork. I've seen it in every case that I've heard about, and honestly, I see it in America now because it's not mysterious, it's just hard to admit. First comes the overreach. Ambitions stretch further and further, military, financial, cultural, until the seam starts to fray. Suddenly, the empire finds itself committed everywhere, trying to do everything at once, spreading its energy thin. Second, currency debasement. The money, which used to symbolize stability, starts to lose its substance. For Spain, it was diluting silver coins. For the US, it's watching the dollar quietly buy less and less and less, even if nobody calls it for what it is. Third is the debt spiral, 38 trillion in government debt for the US. Borrowing becomes a habit, not a strategy. Governments borrow to pay for yesterday's promises, and the interest rate alone becomes an anchor that drags everything else down. Fourth, loss of productive capacity. This one's especially brutal. Factories close, skills disappear, fields lie fallow. The things that built the society in the first place are now hollowed out, while everyone pretends nothing has changed. In the US, this is currently happening with the labor force struggling because of immigration changes. Fifth, social decay. Inequality grows. Trust erodes. People stop believing that hard work leads anywhere. Does this remind you of anything? The gap between those who have and those who don't starts to feel unbridgeable, and frustration becomes a way of life. Sixth is the loss of reserve currency status. The world starts looking for alternatives. The privilege of being the global currency flips to a vulnerability, and suddenly all the advantages of the past become liabilities. Seven is, of course, collapse. The process that felt slow for so long suddenly speeds up, shortages appear, the rules break down, and what used to seem unthinkable quickly becomes the new normal. Not with fanfare, but with a quiet kind of finality. It's never exactly the same. Each society has its own script, its own set of excuses, but the shape of the story is almost always familiar. And when I look around America, I see the steps lining up, whether we want to acknowledge them or not. We love to think that America is the exception, protected by geography, by technology, by history itself, but debt is just background noise for now. Nobody talks seriously about what happens when the bill comes due. Young people stare down impossible rents and vanishing jobs, and a lot of them just quietly opt out. That trust that used to hold neighborhoods and families and futures together is now being rationed, and nobody quite knows how to refill it. Collapse, when it comes, never kicks down the door with a warning. It just sneaks in. Another year, a little tougher than the last, until one day the stories we've always believed just stop fitting the world that we're living in. For most people, it's not a dramatic moment. It's a growing sense that the work you do matters less, that the future you imagined is getting blurrier, and that the rules you thought were fixed are quietly being rewritten by forces you'll never even meet. Honestly, I think it's tempting to pin all of this on easy villains. It's satisfying to say collapse comes down to a handful of bad actors, corrupt elites, reckless wars, politicians making promises they have no intention of keeping. That story is tidy, and it almost feels like a relief, because then the rest of us can just shrug and say, well, what did you expect? But if I'm being honest, I don't think it's ever that simple. What I see looking at history and looking around me now is something more uncomfortable. Empires don't stretch themselves thin just because a king or a president wanted a bigger palace. It's the expectations that build up everywhere at every level, like a pressure cooker. It's the sense from the most powerful to the most ordinary that things will just keep getting better forever, or at least the stability is our default setting, like the golden age of capitalism and the eternal bull market of the last century. I see it everywhere I look. Spanish nobles assuming the world would keep sending them silver forever, British office workers believing the pound was safe forever, Soviet farmers who trusted the grocery lines would always somehow deliver, and now the USA assumes, without ever saying it out loud, that the shelves will always be stocked, the dollars will always mean something, that the normal people grew up with is just permanent. The collapse, when it finally arrives, is not really a single catastrophe. It's more like a slow confrontation with the fact that all of those deals that the US made with the future, the bargains about what effort would get it, what tomorrow would bring, have quietly expired, and nobody called to tell the US. By the way, if you're enjoying this and want more of these kinds of conversations, I'd love it if you subscribe. The House of L is full of thoughtful, curious people, and you're always welcome here. Now, when I look for villains in these stories, I don't find any one single face to blame, just the relentless math of debts piling up, resources running thin, and old promises that somehow manage to outlast the reality that once made them possible. So where does this leave us, honestly? I think a lot of people, especially those in charge, still want to believe we're early in the story, that there's plenty of time to fix things if we just find the right lever to pull. But when I look around, I don't see a country on the verge of renewal. I see a place where the warnings have already piled up and the responses keep getting smaller and more desperate. The US has spent years, even decades, running on this treadmill of overreach, military spending, financial engineering, cultural chest thumping, And meanwhile, the industries that actually make things, build things, employ people in decent jobs have mostly vanished or hollowed out. They've been replaced by symbols and services, apps and abstraction. The real work and the real rewards seem to flow upward now toward people who already have far more than it's enough for them. Every time we get a wake-up call, a financial meltdown, a pandemic, a sudden spike in social unrest, the pattern is the same. We paper over the cracks, we end up doubling down on whatever was already broken, the safety nets fray, the cost of living climbs, and if you're in the top 0.1%, you might feel some turbulence, but for everyone else, it's a relentless squeeze. Wages lag, rents explode, the price of everything from homes to groceries feels untethered from reality. If you have assets, you ride the wave. If you don't, well, good luck. The ground just keeps shifting beneath your feet. What I hear over and over is that this time is different. The collapse is something that happens to other places, not in the US. There is new technology now. There is the dollar. It's America we're talking about. But history loves irony. And if there is one thing I notice in every story of decline, is that people living through it always insist that they are the exception, right up until the moment they're not. And here's the hardest part. Decline never feels like emergency until suddenly it does. It feels like grinding daily hardship. It feels like politicians having the same arguments every year, like a loop you can't quite break out of. It feels like being stuck in the present tense where nothing really changes for the better and the promise of the future starts to sound like a story told for someone else's benefit. So why don't people see the end coming? It's not denial. It's just that daily life keeps us focused on the immediate, work, family, getting by. Even as things shift, we adapt and move forward, and only later do we realize the stories we believe have quietly unraveled. The real test isn't how long we defer the pattern, it's how we show up for each other as things change. Collapse is never just about numbers or territory. It's about daily life, about whether trust and decency and kindness survive when the old systems fade. If you want a clear way to think through confusing times, check out my book Awake. There is a 10% launch discount this week and the link is below. And if you want to see where all of this leads, subscribe. The House of L is always open. Empires fall, but we remain.